will unearth the heady mix of incompetence, insanity, and corruption that surrounded America's response to it, which will feed through into the response in the UK and across Europe. Now, whilst my sympathy goes out to anyone that was affected by this novel virus, let's be clear, the vast majority of the public faced a vanishing chance of being made seriously ill or dying from COVID-19. It was a predominantly mild seasonal respiratory virus with an average age of death of over 80, which is actually higher than life expectancy in most Western countries, including America. So technically, if you got COVID, you live longer. Now, I say that in jest, but that important statistic will surprise many who, to this day, were given the impression that this was the bubonic plague 2.0. The truth is that the bulk of those who tragically succumbed to this virus had serious comorbidities. But I hate to tell you, it was ever thus. If you're not a healthy person, if you have major health issues, very sadly, you are always at risk from any number of ailments, and you always will be. Them's the breaks. Obesity was another key metric in relation to risk profile from COVID-19, which is very sad, but what are you going to do? If you are overweight or obese, you also have a higher risk of heart disease, joint problems, kidney disease, depression, cancer, and in the longer term, dementia. For us to be surprised during COVID that anyone overweight was more vulnerable demonstrates that the virus was made to seem like we were all at risk. It wasn't true. We were not. But the truth is that we all paid the price, didn't we? We were all punished in the same way in what was, in my view, a vain and failed attempt to stop a respiratory virus, something that in history has never been achieved. Like I said at the time on my show on Talk Radio and latterly on GB News, virus gonna virus. I got hell for saying it at the time, as well as hell for chopping up a face mask on the radio in a video that was seen 5 million times. And of course, anybody who spoke out was attacked and cancelled. Just like Twitter and other social media outlets were closing people's accounts for sharing the lab leak theory, which the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, now thinks is the most likely explanation. I don't know why governments, aided and abetted by a complicit media profiting from state-sponsored scare ads, decided to create such hysteria around the virus. My best guess was their adherence to the scourge of health and safety culture, a perception among politicians in particular and the scientists advising them that whilst all evidence suggested this was a predominantly mild virus, they'd better exaggerate its threat in order to protect themselves from future criticism. If we drum up panic about this virus, they thought, and introduce draconian measures like lockdowns and masking, as well as those ridiculous arrows in supermarkets, then they can say, oh well, at least we did something. At least we took measures in the event of any future inquest or inquiry.
That guidance is backed up in law. It is not a request. It is a requirement in law, and people need to follow it.
So, for example, with regard to those masks, for which there was never any compelling data suggesting they would stop COVID, I think that the authorities simply covered our faces to cover their asses. It's my view that lockdowns were born out of panic. Fair enough, we're all human, and I do sympathise with any politician in the early stages of the pandemic sitting there in their office in the dead of night, imagining the worst case scenario. They didn't want to have blood on their hands. But ultimately, as with masking, given the lack of evidence that these damaging lockdowns would arrest the spread of the virus, you can only judge a decision to shut down the economy, to lock people in their homes, and to deprive children of a school education as having been largely performative. That's right, it's my view that the lockdowns were performative. It was part of COVID theatre and an approach of hashtag being seen to do something. What's most egregious about the COVID response from countries like the United States and the UK is the contrast with other locations, countries like Sweden, who did not lock down or enforced masking. They did no mask mandates. They didn't have lockdowns. They kept most schools and hospitality open, and they fared better than everyone else. Now, for those saying that Sweden is a different type of country, you can't compare the two. All right, why then did they even beat their Scandinavian neighbours? Shockingly, US and UK politicians and public health officials didn't learn any lessons as we went along. In fact, their actions became ever more illogical and pig ignorant. How countries like the US and the UK went into second and third lockdowns after data from no lockdown countries like Sweden showed a similar trajectory of the virus is anyone's guess. In the end, Sweden won the argument. Wait for this statistic, folks. They boast the lowest excess deaths in Europe from 2020 to 2022, with excess deaths being the most reliable and trustworthy metric. In fact, that remarkable trend on the part of Sweden carried on into 2023. The biggest problem with the pandemic response was that it didn't make sense, locking up healthy people and wrecking the economy for a virus for which a third of citizens would have no symptoms at all. That is official UK data, by the way. A third of people would be
This is an urgent message for every American. Due to recent events involving the healthcare CEO, this 5,000
would be asymptomatic. In the UK, a COVID ad campaign said, act like you've got it. That's right. The main slogan of the ad campaign was, act like you've got it. So there you go. A pandemic so bad, you had to pretend to have the disease. In the novel 1984, George Orwell famously wrote, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. And during COVID, we were told not to believe our eyes and ears. None of it made sense. It didn't make sense that we were locked in our homes, but allowed to go to the supermarket for an hour a day with everyone else. It didn't make sense that you could sit on an airplane or in a restaurant in a mask, but could remove the mask when it was time for dinner. Who knew that COVID was so repelled by the sight of someone swallowing their food? It didn't make sense that states like Florida and Texas, with full sports stadia and people conducting largely normal lives, existed alongside states like New York and California, whose residents existed under totalitarian COVID rule. Same country, different pandemic, apparently. And it didn't make sense that early in the pandemic, top medics like Anthony Fauci in the US and Jenny Harries in the UK advised against wearing masks.
People should not be walking around with masks,
which Harries in particular said could be counterproductive. But above and beyond that, it didn't make sense that the masks, the holes in which are 500 to 1,000 times larger than the virus, were somehow, miraculously, I don't know how, maybe osmosis or something, going to stop COVID. The masks, of course, were not a public health policy. It was propaganda to remind you that we were in a pandemic, and was the brainchild not of medics, but of behavioural scientists. Those blue surgical masks, which now pollute oceans and are festering in landfill, can at best stop a surgeon dribbling saliva onto your internal organs when he or she performs open heart surgery. The Germans mandated higher, superior quality masks, but the virus trajectory remained the same as other countries. A mask was never going to stop a tiny virus, and it never will. Donald Trump's administration will expose all of that with the help of RFK Jr., who exposed America's chief scientific advisor in the book The Real Anthony Fauci. Fauci has not sued for a syllable written in that rather damning book. Can't imagine why. So why does all of this matter? Why can't we just move on? All of this is in the past. Why does the truth need to come out? Well, because of the needless damage done to people after this, in my view, failed experiment. And because we've got to make sure it never happens again. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the world's leading medics at Stanford Medical School, called lockdowns the biggest public health mistake in history. He and his colleagues, who signed the Great Barrington Declaration, which argued for focused protection of the vulnerable, were attacked, vilified and censored. But of course, looking back on it, they were right. After all, look at the lonely pensioners who died alone during the pandemic, socially distanced from their loved ones. Children whose life chances and mental health have been eviscerated as a result of lost school hours and contact with their friends and teachers. Worth noting the physical and psychological damage to children of being forced to wear those wretched, filthy masks in the classroom all day long, without even a shred of evidence that suggested that would stop COVID. That was cruelty. That was child abuse. The economic damage that we've seen as a result of lockdowns has threatened stability across the world in terms of the economy, as countries printed empty billions, leading to eye-watering levels of debt to be paid for by future generations, and the crippling inflation which has hurt the poorest most. The once viable small to medium-sized businesses that went to the wall, whilst corporate giants like Pfizer, Amazon and Google enjoyed the greatest gold rush in history. Now, I was broadcasting throughout the pandemic, and I called out the insanity of almost all of these measures. So how would I have done things differently? Well, I would have done Sweden times 100. I would have informed people about the risk of the virus, and I would have written a blank check to place a ring of steel around the vulnerable, and I would have let everybody else get on with their lives. Show me one country in the world that had little to no measures, and show me a disproportionately higher death toll from COVID. No such country exists. Going back to Sweden, you would expect there, wouldn't you? You would expect there to be more dead Swedish people. Well, the same goes for Florida, which should have seen more deaths given their light touch throughout the pandemic. Well, you would expect a disproportionately high death toll. Again, it cannot be found. In fact, a study published in the revered medical journal The Lancet suggested that when adjusted for age and levels of public health, Florida actually fared better than Stalinist lockdown-loving California. But here's the best bit, folks, because whilst the new Trump administration will expose the folly of lockdowns and masking and social distancing, the 6-meter rule, all that nonsense, all measures, by the way, inspired by the Chinese Communist Party, it's the vaccine rollout which may be the greatest travesty of all. The key selling point of the vaccine was that if you took it, you protected others. The greatest lie at the heart of this public health fiasco. Now, the vaccine may have protected those vulnerable to the virus who faced hospitalization or death, and for that we can be delighted it was invented and indeed that people got it. But in the 3 years since the release of the first jabs, no medic has successfully explained to me why healthy people needed to be pressurized into taking this vaccine when they faced no mortal risk from COVID. But it was a jab which came with potential negative side effects. Let me tell you a tragic story, and it's Lisa Shaw, a BBC radio producer in her 40s, a slim, healthy, fit mother of one, and a much-loved wife to her husband Gareth, who I've been in touch with. Now, Lisa was not someone who was in an at-risk category. The bottom line is that you don't need to be the professor of medicine at Harvard to know that Lisa Shaw did not technically need to be vaccinated based upon her health profile. She could have got COVID. She would have got COVID. She might not have had symptoms. She could have been one of the third of people who had no symptoms at all. Act like you've got it. Or she might have spent a day or two in bed with flu-like symptoms. Statistically, COVID would not have killed her, but the vaccine did. It is the cause of death on her death certificate, and now Gareth is widowed and their little boy orphaned. Now, was the jab rollout motivated by profit on the part of the pharmaceutical companies rather than public health? Well, this new administration will find the answer. But it's odd that, for example, the UK government's own vaccine agency, the JCVI, advised against jabbing children, but pressed on with the rollout anyway. Make it make sense. The UK government, on the advice of its chief scientific officer, ignored this ruling from the JCVI and jabbed kids. The mortal threat from COVID to children was statistically almost non-existent. Broadly speaking, COVID didn't kill kids. The flu, in fact, is worse for kids in terms of mortality. And yet, with concerns around blood clotting and myocarditis, particularly around young men and boys, that's a serious condition, by the way, involving inflammation of the heart, then we risked the lives and the health of the most precious and vulnerable group in our society, children. We dragged them out of school, impacted their life prospects, made them miserable as they couldn't see their friends or jump on the swings in the park or play ball, and we injected them with a medication any doctor that wasn't in the grip of this insane mass psychosis would consider needless. The medical mantra, first do no harm, was discarded during the pandemic, as we also harmed the economy, as we harmed free speech and free scientific debate, as we harmed the elderly, as we harmed the environment. Those filthy masks that aren't recyclable have now entered fish and therefore ultimately the human food chain, as well as those mountains of plastic from the testing kits. A virus, by the way, so bad you had to test yourself for it every day. Make it make sense. We harmed the economy. We harmed mental health. We harmed and ruined people's lives. First do no harm became first do so much harm. And under Donald Trump, those responsible will be exposed and held to account. We weren't victims of COVID. We were victims of the response to it. And it's time now for those responsible to be held to account. Some of them should be locked down in jail.
You know, after 40 years in the roofing business.
Well, when you mention to someone the absurdity of the pandemic, they often come back with, yeah, I guess we just didn't know any better. When someone says that to me, I go crazy bananas because that person's giving world leaders and the media a pass for things that they should have known and making truly nonsense rules, the governments and the media did, based on things that they did not study. They chose not to study. Here's just one lame example of no benches on a beach because COVID. There was never any science behind that. So this is a segment for you to either send to your friends, or if you're the kind of person that says, well, we just didn't know any better because we knew better, and I'm going to prove it to you. Now, not me personally. I'm not a medical professional. I didn't know the fatality rate of COVID or research about masks, infection-acquired immunity. I'm not a medical professional, but the medical community knew. And I'm going to show you. I brought the receipts today because I'm pissed when people say that to me and we have news about something that they lied to us about and knew better. We were prevented from asking questions. We were shut down on social media. We called people who asked these questions crazy. We know because we were forced to study for ourselves the last 4 years what the medical community has long since known, but they kept it from us. So here are the things that we supposedly didn't know about that medical professionals did know about. Infection-acquired immunity, COVID mortality rates, masking, lockdowns, COVID vaccine adverse events. They knew all of this stuff and they told us lies about it. So let's start with the first one because it's topical. Today, Representative Thomas Massie shared this clip of himself asking the CDC why they published data showing that the COVID vaccine was 92% effective for people who already had COVID. Now, you recall at the time, people who already had COVID were wondering, do I even need a vaccination? He saw a report from the CDC showing that people who were vaccinated or who were previously infected did in fact have a 92% less chance of getting COVID if they took the vaccine later. And he says, there's no data to show that. Anybody who'd been reading up on the time knew that none of the clinical trials had anything to do with previous COVID infections. So he called them and said, well, why are you saying this? Now, this is a long clip. It's about 5 minutes, but I want to watch it together because it is crystal clear that they made stuff up and they continued lying about it. And then we're going to continue in this vein. So watch.
These MMWR.
I know you've been seeing all the news about the crazy stuff these celebrities are doing at those parties with the baby oil. The news is telling us they confiscated about 1,000 bottles. And his lawyer said that there's a Costco down the block, which is where they're getting all this from. everybody going to be coming out now about some messed up situation they seen at one of these parties in LA. But what they won't tell you is that there is something even bigger going on, and they just using all this mess to distract you from what's going on behind closed doors. You see, the Gov likes to give out benefits to all Americans, but they always do it when the public is.
These MMWR, they said that the vaccine was 92% efficacious for those who had already had COVID. I was struck by this claim because, well, first of all, I was interested because I had already had COVID and I was wondering whether to take the vaccine or not. And I had studied the Pfizer data, the top-line data and the FDA characterization of it. And you know what? The problem with the CDC's claim is completely inaccurate. The trials didn't prove that at all. The trials weren't designed to prove that. So I called up the CDC and I recorded the phone call. And they said, we'll get the top scientist on the line with you and we'll find out what the deal is here. And they got their top scientist on the line. And she said, wow, you found a mistake in our paper. I can't believe this was in there. We will fix this. We're going to call you Eagle Eye Massey over here at the CDC. And said, okay, that's great. I appreciate you fixing this because there's no data to support this.
Wait, can you
So
pause for a
month goes
second?
by.
Can we pause this here?
In January of
Philip,
2021.
I'm sorry. So what he's saying is that the CDC put data into a paper and then they're like, oh, yeah, I don't know where that came from. This idea that people who had COVID, that the vaccine was 92% efficacious for them. And they're like, oh, that's funny. What? How does that happen? How do you accidentally have data that never existed? Okay, let's let him, I just can't let that go. Go ahead.
And I call up and I look at their website, lo and behold, nothing has been fixed. And I then started contacting people at the CDC, and they were very averse to fixing it, the misstatement. And this began a saga. Just 3 minutes or 3 hours into the Biden administration was one of these phone calls when the cover-up started to begin. They were conflicted. They wanted everybody to take the vaccine. They didn't have data that showed it would help anybody who had already had the COVID infection, but they didn't want to change this. So I made lots of calls, recorded them all. They admitted to me that they were wrong and said they would fix it. They eventually changed it, but they never did fix it. Okay, so then a FOIA request went to CDC, and they produced over 1,000 pages. Most of it redacted like this. The FOIA request was every conversation about Congressman Massey, and it produced, at CDC, it produced over 1,000 pages. Imagine that. But they were mostly redacted. They didn't want to say what they were saying about the truth that I was giving to them. So then I've been trying for years, and I tried in October and I tried in December of 2023 to get these unredacted emails. Well, right before this hearing, lo and behold, you all produced some unredacted emails. Here's the problem. You left out dozens of them. Dozens of these emails that were responsive to the request. And it was not by accident. These aren't minor oversights. Like, here are the kind of redactions. The whole entire email is redacted. The subject is the call from Rep. Thomas Massey. These are the kind of redactions. Look at this. Entire pages redacted. My question is, when are you going to produce these? And why are you not producing these? Why are you pretending that these emails don't exist? Some of them are in my inbox. Some of them are to me, but they're not in your production. Why?
Getting older means a world of change, but some things stay the same, like being
are to me, but they're not in your production. Why?
Congressman, I want to thank you for acknowledging the production that my team did last week to you. And if there are specific documents that are not included and you can identify them, I am happy to continue to work with you and with the committee staff for productions. That production, as with all of the requests before this committee, have not stopped. We are happy to continue to work. We are happy to continue producing documents on a rolling basis, or if there's specific requests for specific documents.
Did you think this one was responsive? The subject is Call with Rep. Massey. It's Ann Tatum, Christina Cerna, and a month ago, Dr. Amanda Cohen and I had a call with Rep. Thomas Massey of Kentucky regarding concern about language in an MMWR from December 13th that was inaccurate. Redacted, redacted, redacted. He called again yesterday and is raising concerns about the issue, including on Twitter. Redacted, 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 redacted. I wanted to let you know in case you hear any more about it. Redacted, redacted, redacted. But wanted you to be aware of this issue is continuing. Dr. Shushat spoke with Rep. Massey today. Redacted, redacted, redacted. Let me know if you have any additional questions. Anstons, why did you think this is not responsive to my request?
Congressman, I'm not saying this was or were not responsive. We did a production last week. We did not say that our productions were finished. I'm happy if there are specific other documents, if there are specific things that you have that you would like us to produce, if you would like us to continue work, we are happy to continue the accommodation.
I've told you specifically what it is. We're 4 years into this. You know, we gave you the list of things to give us. We said the things that were responsive to the FOIA request. You conspicuously left out the most relevant emails. We're out of time. You are out of time. We are tired of this. It's not incompetence, it's insolence. And I yield back.
Alberto in our chat says that should be the new redacted intro.
Yeah.
Redacted, redacted, redacted.
Right.
I know, I was thinking that too as I was watching that. I was like,
of course, I'm here for the branding.
Yeah, exactly.
How absolutely frustrating it is that like, he's like, I've given you this request. We want these documents. Like, here are these documents. Like, well, I can't read them. They're redacted. And they're like, oh, well, then here's some that aren't redacted. Like, but where are the other documents? Well, if you have specific requests, it's like, well, I already gave you the damn request.
Gave you them.
Give me everything that's redacted to unredact it and send it back to me. That's what, like, how clear is that?
Well, and also that it's from his inbox. Like, it's from his own email that they're redacting.
There's some, right, because they must have forwarded some of his emails as well. So clearly he's saying this data never existed and you put it into a public study. You need to retract this. And when they hadn't, why have you not done this yet? Why are you still not telling the American people that you did not test the COVID vaccine against previous infection? Why? They knew better. That's why. That's the whole purpose of this segment, is I'm proving to you they knew better. They knew, and the data has borne out, real world data has borne out since, that previous infection to COVID is superior to any pharmaceutical made vaccination. And here is a congressional hearing last year where Iowa Representative Marionette Miller Meeks, a doctor, is talking on a panel to another doctor, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, about infection-acquired immunity.
Fanatics who wants to vaccinate every person in this country, even though they are children who has very little risk for it, even though they've already had the COVID, that has undermined the trust in other vaccines enormously, creating enormous vaccine hesitancy.
So not allowing their provider or physician to determine the risk and the benefit.
Yeah, and also people themselves, because people know that about immunity. We learned that in school. People know that if you've had a disease, you are...
It wasn't until I came to Congress that I found out infection-acquired immunity was a novel concept.
Yeah, I guess we knew about it since 430 BC of the Athenian plague until 2020, and then we didn't know about it for 3 years, and now we know about it again, so...
Okay, that was convenient. They knew better. That one's a mic drop. Okay, we were told here on YouTube we couldn't even say the words natural immunity because other channels were getting strikes for that. On Twitter, people were downranked for talking about natural immunity, meaning in previous infection. Okay, so that one, they knew better. You can't say that anymore. Don't say that. Let's go forward and discuss COVID mortality rates. Well, we knew right away that COVID was not dangerous for children and young people and was the most dangerous for the elderly. Here is real data from the CDC today showing that again, people who are older have a higher risk of death, not with COVID, but involving COVID now. They don't even attribute these deaths to COVID anymore because they cannot prove it, because they told us that people were dying of COVID when really they had comorbidities and pre-existing conditions and complications. And in fact, later they would report deaths involving COVID as COVID. And the CDC later admitted that they overcounted.
Attention patriots, the Trump second-term gold bar is finally here. But only the most loyal VIPs are eligible to claim this exclusive piece of history. To honor Trump's...
CDC later admitted that they overcounted COVID deaths. They did know better from real-world data leading up to pandemic lockdowns and decisions, and they only admitted this after the Guardian investigation pointed it out. They were never going to admit it until they were caught. So at least some experts knew that COVID was less fatal, as the government and the media put it, and certainly less fatal and less dangerous for younger people and healthy people, but we were not allowed to discuss that or share that on social media. People knew better. Okay, now, which brings me to masking. We knew that masking for long periods of time was dangerous, and we knew that it did not necessarily filter out the COVID virus. This is the best study I've seen on the toxicity of masks, and if you read it and go to the references section, it shows that scientists have known for decades that there is a danger of CO2 inhalation from prolonged mask exposure. Read this, find this paper, screenshot it if you have to. In fact, scientists have known that prolonged CO2 inhalation from mask exposure and other prolonged CO2 exposure in other ways can lead to at least these things: testicular dysfunction, stillbirths, reduced motor and verbal skills for children, and overall cognitive decline for children, especially those born during the pandemic. We knew this. At least some of these studies are dated the 1970s. So somebody knew that the mask requirement could be dangerous for people. So why weren't we allowed to say it? And in fact, on YouTube through 2021, there was a ban against what they called misinformation, including claims that masks do not play a role in preventing the contraction and transmission of COVID-19. In fact, Senator Rand Paul had a video removed and a suspension from his channel because he posted a video saying that masks did not necessarily prevent the spread. Many channels were taken down or had penalties because of it. Why didn't we hear from experts who'd been studying this for decades? During the pandemic, this data existed. Why did they keep it from us? We also knew that COVID particulates could penetrate masks, and when they did, masking could increase the danger of COVID due to something called the Fogen effect. This is a study from 2022 showing that mask wearing can make COVID exposure worse, given that when the virus gets in there, you can't exhale it. It goes deeper into your lungs while you're wearing a mask. And so you may get a bigger viral load, and that increased mortality rates in counties that had mask mandates. But yet mask mandates were kept in place. We never debated the Fogen effect. Why? Okay. We also worried that masks could be toxic, but we required young children to wear them anyway, all day outside in the heat. Here's a study from 2023 published by the NIH. And again, the reference section shows that experts knew that exposure to the toxins that exist in these masks were worse, and in fact, worse, dangerous and worse in hot weather. Some of these studies were done as early as the 1990s, and yet we were not allowed to debate masks. We were told, send your kids in these masks with these toxins.
Do you remember those awful videos out of Italy too, when they were having that heat wave and the schools, you know, in Europe, they don't really have air conditioning. They don't believe in air conditioning. And in Italy, it was, I think in Naples, they had all these kids in these like heat wave classrooms, and they were wearing masks. And
no, I think about my kids like in a gym running in masks in heat, and I'm so pissed off still about it.
And North Carolina is, go ahead, Philip.
Oh, it's like, I was going to say, like, I remember like when they were pushing the mask mandates, you'd see all these pictures from like the Spanish flu epidemic of, what was it, like the 20s, wasn't it around there or something like that?
Yeah.
Where you'd see all these pictures of people wearing their cloth masks and stuff like that. It's like, that's what we reverted to. We immediately just went back to, let's go back to the 1920s and do what they did then, because that seemed to work.
Yeah.
And North Carolina right now has a bill before Congress in North Carolina that would make it illegal for people to wear face coverings in public for health reasons. No more masks in North Carolina. The Senate's already passed the bill, and it would make it illegal to wear face coverings for health reasons of any kind.
illegal to mandate a mask or to wear a mask? Like you could still choose to if you wanted to, right?
It would make it illegal to wear a face covering for health reasons of any kind. The provision was intended to repeal the exemption that people had for health reasons.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, no masking in North Carolina.
Nevertheless, and a friend of mine who's a nurse, she said they taught us in medical school, in nursing school, that a mask is only effective for 20 minutes. And then you either have to change it or do something. But, you know, we kept kids in them all day. Okay, let's move on to lockdowns because we could talk a blue streak about masking. Did we know that lockdowns could be dangerous for populations? Well, we knew a lot of things that we were not allowed to discuss. For instance, we knew that this would lead to an increase in domestic violence. We knew that weakening an economy would lead to depression and increase alcoholism. We've seen all of these things. Did we know what it would do to children to take them out of school? We did. Here is one such study published. These studies are old. This one's from 2013, talking about what happens when someone loses up to 1 year of education, is that their life expectancy drops. Look at this chart. For every year less of education that a child gets, their life expectancy increases from preventable causes, meaning the more a child stays in school, the more likely they are to live a healthy life and not die from preventable causes. We knew that. Every year of missed education lowers life mortality. Now think about that. Some of these charts are from as far back as 2004. But I mean, Jennifer Say, the head of Levi, she lost her job from saying this is bad for our kids to be out of school. And we were told that lockdowns and school closures were necessary. We cost children their life expectancy from a virus that did not harm them. The data was there. And finally, about the COVID vaccine, well, again, we've been over this ad nauseum. You can read the early trials yourself, and you will know that the vaccine was not tested for the spread of COVID-19, even though the government and the media said that it would prevent the spread. The clinical trials were never meant to test that. Early trials only showed adverse events like cough, or the early trials only tested for symptoms, basically. Like, did you cough or sneeze within the time of vaccination? And so we've been over this data. They did show adverse events like myocarditis and stroke, and not in small numbers that were insignificant. You can read the clinical trials yourself and also read what's called the marketing material. This is an adverse events report from as early as February of 2021, 2 months into the vaccine rollout, that showed adverse events. We went over it. In fact, going over this document got us a channel strike on YouTube because this was, see who published this? This was not conjecture. We went over Pfizer's own documents and got punished here on YouTube.
Yeah, they banned us for 2 weeks.
Right. So I'm not going to go over it again. I'm going to show it to you. You can seek it out. Yeah. But, this was not a they didn't know better situation. So read it for yourself. You will never say something as dumb as they didn't know better. But, if you wanted to know for yourself, if you wanted to ask questions, you were called a crazy conspiracy theory. Here's what Russell Brand had to say about this recently on X, saying AstraZeneca withdrawn from after admitting blood clots. Pfizer settling cancer cases out of court. Former CNN anchors taking ivermectin. Where is your conspiracy theory now? And in fact, the former director of the CDC recently said on Chris Cuomo's show that, young, healthy people who didn't need the COVID vaccine were harmed. Well, it's nice that he's saying this now, but why didn't he say this all along when it's clear, I think, from the data I've just presented to you, that they should have known that already? So let's let him say it, and then we're going to collectively get pissed off again.
The best part about this is that you don't need to give any personal info, just a name and an address to send it.
Those of us that tried to suggest there may be significant side effects from vaccines, we kind of like with the rest of your show that you had early on, we kind of got canceled because no one wanted to talk about the potential that there was a problem from the vaccines because they were afraid that that would cause people not to want to get vaccinated. The reality is, I was part of Warp Speed. These are important vaccines. We saved a lot of lives. They're important for the most vulnerable people, those over 60, 65 years of age. They really aren't that critical for those that are under 50 or younger. But those vaccines saved a lot of lives, but they're also, we have to be honest, some people got significant side effects from the vaccine. I have a number of people that are quite ill, and they never had COVID, but they are ill from the vaccine, and we just have to acknowledge that.
All right. Well, it's too late for you to be acknowledging it now. People were hurt. Some people have lifelong adverse events now that they still have to deal with, if they still have a life. Right. If you know what I mean. Now, he says here that vaccines save lives. We've been over this data ad nauseum. The studies that they use to say that the vaccine saved lives is about as reliable as a disposable diaper. It's the fact that fewer people were put on respirators is their main, vaccines saved lives. And the fact that we never got to the mathematical modeled death counts that they expected. That's the only proof that they have to say that vaccines saved lives. So I can't let that one go. So my question here, now that I've laid out all of the receipts showing that the medical community knew things that we were not allowed to talk about, and the media lacked curiosity to learn those things, we didn't here on Redacted. We've done our homework. You can't say that they didn't know. The government also lacked curiosity to learn the things that the medical community already knew. So you cannot give them a free pass anymore. These people in power had an opportunity to know better, and they chose not to. So the only people I think that can say that they didn't know are people who got their news from the corporate media and world governments. Those people were lied to on purpose, and they didn't know. But that pass is expiring, you guys. If after all this, you still trust the corporate media and the government, it is high time that you knew better.
I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. YouTube thinks that you'll actually